The first clue was not lipstick, or a late night, but a calendar reminder that moved itself like a guilty thought. A routine doctor's visit became a blocked afternoon, then a pattern of vanishing hours. An expense for a gift I never received appeared beside a rideshare path that ended at an unfamiliar office tower. I counted days on a private spreadsheet and felt a clock start to hammer, louder with every discrepancy. When the test turned pink, she placed it on our bathroom counter like a white flag. The math did not love me back. Before the truth arrived in full, my job, my reputation, and even my skin would be dragged into a theater I never auditioned for. The question wasn't whether I would break. It was how cleanly I could cut. I used to measure my life in small, reliable rituals. Coffee before dawn. A jog along the river where the city keeps its secret coolness, the water carrying last night's neon into the new day. A scan of project dashboards, emails, deadlines. My wife preferred late mornings and long, measured evenings, candlelight and playlists that never rushed. We were not dramatic, we were consistent, or so I believed. Consistency can feel like love until you examine it closely and realize it is also a place where shadows can rest undisturbed. My work required diligence and calm. Data operations for a logistics firm does not thrill dinner guests, but it rewards patience. I safeguarded shipments with clean code and clean records, protecting packages that had their own small destinies, medicine, textbooks, a set of baby clothes headed somewhere. I took pride in being the person who prevented chaos. It made the way everything unraveled feel almost personal, as if disarray had waited for me. The first hairline crack arrived on a quiet Tuesday. A shared calendar alert called. Routine check-in. Slid from morning to mid-afternoon. She rarely moved appointments, and when she did, she mentioned it in passing. That day ended with a new habit, refreshing our joint bank app. A purchase appeared, flowers from a boutique I'd never heard of, and a ride that left our neighborhood and returned near dusk. The receipt sat like a leaf on still water, barely rippling the surface. I let it go, because love trains you to give the benefit of the doubt, and because doubt felt like an act of vandalism. Then the patterns multiplied. Hairline cracks turn into a spiderweb if you keep staring. Her phone lived face down. Her gym bag became heavier on days she came home smelling like expensive soap I did not own. My timeline sensibility, so good at protecting other people's packages, turned inward. I felt like a warehouse manager walking aisles under flickering lights, sensing that something had been moved but unable to name which pallet. At work, I tracked driver hours with precision soft as rain. Our company had a spotless public commitment to fairness. The private reality required constant proof that I deserved to be in the room. My diligence was not a moral achievement, it was a survival strategy. I learned to keep receipts, keep logs, keep my tone gentle, keep my face calm even when someone re-explained my own proposal back to me with a new name on it. The routines of bias were polite and practiced, performance metrics that shifted when I exceeded them, concerns about my tone when I asserted facts, unspoken calculations about optics. I kept my head and stacked evidence. I thought I was building a wall to keep chaos out. When the test turned positive, she left it on the counter like a small lighthouse, hopeful, saline. The light did not guide me safely anywhere. I did the math quietly, like a person counting pulses in the dark. We had been careful about timing for reasons we both understood and had not discussed in a while. Stress had built a scaffolding around intimacy, and our calendar had more red days than green. The margin of error was not large enough to include me. I felt the floor tilt, and caught the edge of the sink with both hands, steadying myself on porcelain and the past. The facts extended themselves quickly. A new sunscreen in her bag from a brand I recognized because of an office newsletter about a charity event. A scent of an aftershave in the car that wasn't mine. I moved like a detective across the small theater of our home, touching nothing, cataloging everything. I built a folder on my laptop labeled with a harmless project name and slipped the private files inside, screenshots of expenses, rideshare routes, a photo of the office tower that had become an unacknowledged waypoint in our life. The building belonged to her company's parent firm. The top floor was an executive suite I had visited once for a recruiting event. The man who had shaken my hand then carried an easy confidence shaped by generations of unexamined authority. His name would return to me later like a bruise surfaced by pressure. For weeks I moved through my rituals, adjusting my gait to accommodate the weight of what I could not say. At work, my manager, politely energetic, fluent in corporate positivity, praised the calm completeness of my dashboards while instructing me to be more visible. I learned to talk about my work like it was a person in need of a publicist. I documented every meeting. I smiled without showing teeth. I did not know then how essential the paper trail would be. The pregnancy changed the air in our home. She hummed while chopping vegetables, a melody I did not know. She installed a water filter on the sink and read labels in the grocery store with new intensity. She reviewed our budget like a project manager and circled line items. The word future took up more space in her sentences, and because I am not cruel, I let it. I cooked more, cleaned more, ensured the quiet, reliable safety of the house we had built. The kindness felt like labor in a field already sold to someone else. On a Sunday evening, a mistake breached her calm. She left an email open on the laptop while she went to answer the door for a package. I did not need to see the words to recognize the shape of intimacy in the formatting. Earnest, compact, a boundaryless familiarity of work hours and private talk braided together. There were no names in the snippet visible on screen, only an affectionate sign-off and a line about our timing. I closed the laptop like a person folding a flag and took a breath that felt like walking out onto thin ice. The betrayal had been a suspicion. It now required a strategy. I did not confront her. Confrontation is for stories that want catharsis but not truth. I wanted the truth to be undeniable, not emotionally debated. I made appointments with quiet professionals whose offices smell like lemon and paper. I read about parental rights and obfuscations, about how courts treat men in my position, about how bias can tilt outcomes while insisting on neutrality. I learned about timelines of gestation and paternity testing protocols and the way HR departments act as both shield and sword when executives are involved. I built a second folder labeled with a number only I understood and split my evidence into nested layers like a set of dolls. The next crack arrived through a colleague who thought he was being friendly. He mentioned a rumor that I was going through some things at home, then smiled with concern that didn't touch his eyes. Rumors are weapons. I traced the shape of the blade back to its maker, someone at her company, someone who understood that undermining me at work would make me more pliable elsewhere. I felt the old, low thrum of warning that black professionals learn to hear long before anyone says anything explicit. I tightened my routines. I began backing up my work to a private drive each evening, time-stamped, with version histories intact. I printed exactly 3 hard copies of the most crucial logs and mailed one to my sister with a casual note about old family photos underneath, something only we would read carefully. On a Thursday, a meeting request arrived from HR about recent performance variability. My metrics were pristine. My attendance was perfect. The request was an invitation to accept a narrative and watch it become true. I accepted the meeting and brought a binder that looked like it belonged to a patient person in a procedural drama. I did not yet know how thoroughly those pages would protect me, or how the same binder would eventually hold a different kind of proof, the kind that cracks the floorboards under people who enjoy standing on others. By the time the second trimester began, our home filled with the faint sound of nesting. She decorated in neutrals and put a tiny framed print on the mantel that said the word hope without irony. I kept watering the plants, kept washing the dishes, kept laying out the trash on Wednesday nights like a person participating in a quiet civic ritual. I was not a martyr. I was a man building a runway, long and smooth enough to carry the weight of what was coming. The night before the ultrasound, I slept with the window open. Far away a train dragged a seam across the dark. I thought about my father's advice about storms. Preparation does not stop the rain, but it changes the way you stand under it. I did not yet see the exact path forward, but I had gathered the maps. The ultrasound photo sat on the fridge, ghostly and declarative. I looked at it each morning the way you look through a closed window in winter, close enough to fog the glass but not so close you leave a mark. My routine spiraled tighter around the investigation. I plotted purchase timestamps against calendar blocks. I cross-referenced rides with corporate events. Patterns resolved themselves like constellations. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. The pyramid pointed to the top floor of that glass tower, to a corner office where decisions and rumors both travel fast. HR called me in with phrases that sounded like gauze, soft, clinical, absorbent. Concerns about focus. Questions about whether my home situation might be impacting my bandwidth. The language floated in the room like antiseptic. I set my binder on the table and arranged my pages, each log as neat as a tiled floor. I laid out my outputs by sprint and quarter, comparative charts that showed consistency like a heartbeat. Evidence is not always enough, but it is never nothing. Their expressions grew careful. The meeting ended with assurances and suggestions and the unspoken message that they would be watching closely. They had been watching all along. Now I was watching back. At home, small acts of erasure gathered force. Her wedding ring lived longer in a dish by the sink than on her hand. Her smiles grew rehearsed. The music in the house shifted from the playlists we loved to a set of songs I associated with her office happy hours. The executive's name surfaced in emails to her, CC chains where he made suggestions that skipped managers and landed like commands disguised as collaboration. She began using new terms from his vocabulary, those optimistic verbs that tech executives favor to turn pressure into vision. I stretched those words out on the table and examined them until the shine faded. Beneath them, the old shape of power gleamed. I learned the company schedules of executive offsites and charity galas, those carefully curated spaces where photographers capture virtue and proximity. I mapped the nights she arrived with a glow that outlasted the lights in our house. I traced her allergy flare-ups to weekends in a different neighborhood and matched the pollen report to an area near his gated street, a small, private triumph of pattern recognition that felt both ridiculous and painfully necessary. Somewhere along the way, my grief learned spreadsheets as a second language. The race element did not arrive with a headline. It arrived in a tone. In the way a neighbor asked after her with extra warmth while regarding me as if I were a visiting instructor at my own life. In the way a coworker suggested that I was lucky to have such a poised wife, as if poise were a currency I had borrowed against. In the way whispers about her standing by me slipped into a narrative derived entirely from assumptions about who fails and who forgives. Bias wears manners in my city. It pours you tea while it writes you out of the story. The worst of it came disguised as advice. A senior colleague, solidly positioned in hierarchies that rarely question themselves, invited me to lunch where he provided a lecture on discretion and optics. He framed it as care. Think of the baby, think of the company, think of how allegations can hurt more than they help, especially for people like us who don't get second chances. People like us. I nodded and chewed until he felt he had been generous. Then I went back to my desk and added a section to my binder called Pressures, listing dates, names, summaries. Some storms arrive with thunder. Others arrive with a certificate of attendance you never signed. In private, I arranged a consultation with an attorney who handled family law and employment retaliation cases. The office was tidy, the plants were real. I provided my evidence without embellishment. The attorney listened and asked questions that tightened the net. The strategy formed in 3 parts. First, protect my work, meticulous logs, clean deliverables, an audit trail so thorough even malice would struggle to bend it. Second, establish the timeline of the pregnancy against our documented intimacy, a conversation that felt clinical and humiliating and necessary. Third, map the channels by which the executive's influence could tilt outcomes, from HR to friendly board members, and prepare counterweights, notarize statements, secure backups, off-site copies, a separate record of interactions that might later be rewritten. I ordered a home paternity test that requires no cooperation. The ethical discomfort sat in my throat like a stone. I did not want to make my life a lab. I wanted the simple dignity of being told the truth by someone who promised to live with me inside it. But dignity without facts is a costume, and I could not wear costumes any longer. I handled the small logistics, dates, samples, chain of custody, with the quiet ritual of a person washing his hands before a meal he must eat alone. Meanwhile, the rumor machine warned. An anonymous post on an internal forum questioned whether my temperament suited leadership, citing no specifics while sounding unctuously reasonable. A project I had shepherded for months was handed publicly to a colleague who thanked me in a footnote that read like an apology to no one. I printed the posts and the announcements and dated them. I deleted nothing. Every ping became part of the record. Every slight found a place in the architecture I was building to stand on when the floor gave way. At home, she grew careful around me, as if we were porcelain cups on a high shelf. She asked about my day with the practiced interest of someone narrating a scene for a camera. She folded tiny clothes that relatives began to send. She looked at me during dinner, and then looked away, holding a thought in a place I could not reach. I took out the trash. I paid the mortgage. I kept the plants alive. You cannot prove love in a ledger, but you can establish maintenance, and sometimes maintenance is the bravest thing left. The paternity result arrived with medical indifference. Numbers and percentages. The quiet verdict of science that did not care about my rituals or her playlists, or the prints on the mantel. The conclusion excluded me so conclusively that even doubt was not allowed a seat. I took a walk that evening and watched light retreat from the river, the skyline turning into a chart of what power looks like when it decides to glow. I breathed in the metallic smell of a storm that had not yet arrived and understood that waiting could no longer be part of the plan. I compiled the evidence like a final exam, the arrays of expenses, the calendar discrepancies, the rideshare patterns, the office gala photos, the HR emails, the posts, the project reassignment memos, the paternity test. I printed a clean timeline that made room for no argument. I separated personal from professional documentation and included a letter addressed to myself, 1 page, clear, articulating boundaries I would not cross and outcomes I would insist upon, respect for myself, protection of my work, legal separation on terms that honored the truth rather than the optics. When I slept that night, I dreamt of a long hallway with doors that opened into weather. Behind one door was rain. Behind another, heat. Behind a third, a wind that smelled like the ocean in a childhood memory. I woke before I found the door I needed. In the morning, I put on my calmest clothes and packed the binder. Climax. The confrontation did not happen in a kitchen lit by confession. It happened in 3 rooms that smell like procedure: my living room, HR's glass office, and a small courtroom with a clock that ran exactly on time. I had decided on the order carefully, guided by my attorney's counsel and my own need to not be written into someone else's storyline again. In the living room, I placed the binder on our coffee table and opened to the summary page. I did not speak. I did not need to. The documents created their own narrative spine. The rides, the expenses, the photos with angled smiles, the paternity report's clinical exclusion. Her face moved through stages I recognized from the 5 stations of self-justification: surprise, denial, reframing, plea, and finally the resignation that comes when a story loses its air. She reached for explanations I could not accept. I kept my hands folded because I had found that hands can make promises all by themselves when they reach out at the wrong time. I had already promised myself not to promise her anything I could not keep. I slid across the separation agreement draft prepared by my attorney. It was crisp as a pressed shirt, legal clarity about property, debt, and the timeline of dissolution. It protected me from financial entanglement with a child who was not mine while ensuring I would not be made a villain in a story about abandonment. It allowed room for decency without costuming me as a savior. She read it with her head bowed, the way people read things when they know the words will enter them and rearrange furniture. In HR's office, the binder wore a different face. Here, the pages spoke not of love but of labor, not of betrayal but of retaliation. I laid out my work outputs, the project handoff, the anonymous post with its polite poison, the meeting notes that documented the gauze soft concerns about my bandwidth, the sudden interest in my personal life that would never have multiplied if I were not who I was, standing where I stood. The executive's involvement remained unspoken in their sentences until I introduced it with dates and CC chains and scheduling coincidences that ceased to be coincidences once stacked side by side. I did not accuse, I demonstrated. The difference matters. Accusation invites debate. Demonstration invites silence. Silence arrived. It sat heavy in the room, bending the air. They requested time to review. I provided them time with the added pressure of a letter from my attorney detailing the legal implications of continued retaliation and the actions that would follow any attempt to rewrite the record. Corporations respond to risk the way a herd responds to lightning. They flinch, circle, and look for the member whose injury will least damage the whole. I ensured that the injury would not be mine. The courtroom was a simple space where words put on uniforms. The judge kept questions clean, the way a surgeon keeps instruments. The agreement went through its paces. The narrative found its official form. The executive did not appear. People like him use other rooms. But his absence was a kind of presence, a vacuum that trained the air. My attorney walked the court through the timeline of marital separation and paternity. She used the word integrity with restraint, which kept it heavy. The process was mercifully short. The paperwork ended a thing that had been ending for months in ways too slow to feel like movement. I felt the paperwork make it official, the way a ship's bell turns a long slide through water into an arrival. Back at the office, the retaliation case did not need to become a war because I had already done the one thing that makes war less likely. I prepared to win it. HR issued a corrective memo, sterile but adequate. The project reassignment reversed itself publicly, with a note that attributed the confusion to a miscommunication that had somehow persisted for weeks without any person attached to it. The anonymous post was investigated and linked to a pseudonymous handle tied to a team adjacent to the executive's office. The write-up concluded with a promise of culture training and community guidelines reinforcement. Phrases that taste like chalk but can still draw lines. I did not accept apologies I had not been offered. I accepted the return of things quietly taken. In the final private room, I sat alone with my binder and turned through the pages like a man counting his own pulse after a hard run. There is a particular relief that arrives when you realize your sanity is intact and your reality was not a fever dream. It is not joy. It is a quiet leveling. I called my sister and told her the storm had finished its worst work. She asked if I needed anything other than rest. I said I needed a clean kitchen and a walk. She laughed, then told me to wash the dishes first. The river would still be there. After a storm, the city steadies itself with the same routines that kept it alive before. Buses run. Dogs pull their owners toward the smell of damp earth. Neon lights confess their colors to puddles. My life did not become a different story. It became the same story told with fewer lies attached to it. The divorce finalized with signatures that looked like the end of a song. She moved to a smaller apartment closer to that glass tower. I boxed her keepsakes carefully and left them by the door, because how you handle other people's history says something about who you remain. I did not ask questions I didn't want honest answers to. The last time I saw her, she wore the look of someone carrying a fragile object that is both precious and heavy. I understood that look. I had carried a lot, too. At work, I requested a lateral move to a team less proximate to the gossip machine. The transfer came with no change in pay, which in this industry is its own victory. I found a manager who valued outcomes over performances of belonging. I kept my logs, not because I feared retaliation anymore, but because clarity had become a habit I wasn't ready to surrender. The binder moved to a high shelf in a closet, labeled with a harmless abbreviation that meant nothing to anyone but me. Sometimes victory is a shelf that does not collapse. The deeper work was private and unglamorous. I met with a counselor whose office held a couch that learned my shape. We talked about betrayal as an event and as a climate. We mapped the quiet corrosion that occurs when you are asked to argue for your own reality in rooms that reward denial. We examined how racial bias had not simply made things harder. It had provided the architecture for other people's decisions about me before I had the chance to make my own. We discuss vigilance and rest, two states that rarely coexist. We built a small practice of tempering vigilance with kindness. Some days, kindness meant allowing myself to measure progress in clean dishes and an unremarkable commute. Community matters after rupture. Friends showed up with meals and stories that didn't center my pain. My sister mailed me a photo of us as kids, wearing matching shirts we hated. She wrote a note about storms and bridges, about how sometimes survival feels like building a bridge with the very wood that used to be your shelter. I put the photo on my fridge where the ultrasound had been. The replacement felt honest, not cruel. It reminded me that timelines can heal when you stop forcing them to overlap. One night I returned to the river path where the city lets itself breathe. The water held the last light with a steadiness that felt like a promise kept. I thought about the baby, a small person who had arrived inside a web of decisions mostly made by adults trying to protect themselves. I considered what responsibility meant when biology and history diverged. The answer I arrived at was not noble, it was practical and compassionate. I would s. The executive remained where executives remain, above the weather, mostly. His organization posted photos of charity events with captions about community and values. The comments were predictable. I did not engage. I watched for a while as one might watch a card trick, recognizing the flourishes. Then I closed the app and washed my dishes. You cannot live your life waiting for other people to develop a conscience on your timeline. You can build systems around them that limit the damage their lack of conscience can cause. My binder on the high shelf was one such system. My boundaries were another. Bias did not end because my binder existed. It doesn't vanish when a single case concludes. It remains in the tone with which a receptionist greets you and the assumption encoded in a performance review rubric. But something did change. The angle at which I stood. I learned to ask for specifics when faced with a fog of concern. I learned to request metrics when handed opinions. I learned to make my own documentation feel like a warm coat rather than a suit of armor. Others noticed. A younger analyst, newly hired and already learning the choreography of apologizing for existing, asked for a copy of my template for meeting notes. I sent it and added a message about storms and bridges. He replied with a smile emoji that somehow did not cheapen anything. Healing was not cinematic. It looked like sleep that reached the bottom of the night. It looked like a kitchen that stayed clean for longer than an hour. It looked like making coffee and tasting it fully. On Saturday mornings, I ran by the river, and the route found a new shape around the construction of a footbridge the city had promised for years and finally funded. The project was slow and undramatic, the kind of civic work that disappears into usefulness. I liked passing it, watching pieces fit where they belong. When the bridge opened, people crossed it without ceremony, merely because it was there and sturdy. There was a lesson in that. Sometimes I catch myself narrating the old timeline as if tweaking it could yield a different ending. If I had confronted earlier. If I had refused the rumor's gravity. If I had left at the first misaligned calendar block. But the mind loves hypotheticals because they give us the illusion that the past is still negotiable. The truth is simpler and less satisfying. I did what I could with who I was at each moment. I kept notes. I kept faith with myself when other faiths were withdrawn. I did not set out to be the kind of person who carries a binder through 3 rooms. But I became him, and he kept me whole. I hold no tidy moral for anyone else. I can offer only what proved useful. Keep your records gentle and thorough. When power begins to write your story for you, pick up your pen even if your hand shakes. Believe patterns the first time they show their teeth. Do not let anyone tell you that dignity requires silence. And if you find yourself standing in a room where people debate your reality as if it were a policy choice, leave with your evidence and your breath intact. There are other rooms. The last page of the binder remains blank by design. It sits there, unfilled, not as a threat but as a promise to myself that not every page needs a crisis to justify its existence. Some pages can remain open for ordinary entries, a good run, a meal cooked properly, a quiet afternoon where no one mentions optics. That emptiness, once terrifying, now makes room for a life not defined by vigilance alone. If betrayal is a storm, justice is rarely thunder. More often it is drainage, systems you build so the next rain runs where it should. I cannot tell you what to forgive or when to leave. I can only ask this: when you are forced to choose between optics and oxygen, which do you pick, and why?